Hello, and welcome to the eighth part of my lecture series, COVID-19, Dodgy Science, Woeful Ethics. Today, I would like to start by saying that I dedicate this entire lecture series to my mother, Suneet Iyer, nee Suneet Veer Singh, who gave me her love for science. And this is her. That's my mom. Like me, she's not a professional scientist, but she has a keen interest in it from her university days. And when I was a teenager, there was a flurry of popular writing in science by people like Stephen Hawking and Carl Sagan. And she would get me all these books. There were also her books from her university days, heavily underlined books by Bertrand Russell. And she passed them on to me after reading them herself, with my father's glasses balanced on the tip of her nose. I vividly remember her looking up occasionally from these books, flushed with excitement, to read out a passage to us. And I also want to thank her for her ruthless discipline when it came to studying. She gave me no quarter. I was expected not just to do well, but also to, more importantly, to really understand my lessons. And what a gift to have got. What greater lesson can a parent give to a child? So thank you, Ammi. This whole effort is dedicated to you. Right. So the World Health Organization and public health thinking in general works with fixed ideas of wealth and hospital resources in judging health issues. But what is health and what are resources? COVID-19 reduced to nothing the resources of the world's richest and most technologically advanced countries. We have to ask ourselves, what was the worth of all these resources when looking at the ravages of COVID-19 in countries like the UK and Italy? These are countries that have made public health services into a defining socio-political project since the middle of the last century. How much of the Western response to COVID-19 was a scientific and public-spirited response to a new disease, and how much of it was the disorientation of being shocked out of its complacency and a scramble to cover up for the fallibility of its vaunted health services? In my previous lectures, I had mentioned Professor Charles Knight. He is a senior doctor in the British NHS and was appointed CEO of the London Nightingale Hospital. This was one of the many surge hospital facilities in the UK that were built to accommodate the anticipated flood of COVID patients requiring ventilators. The London Nightingale was built with 4,000 beds and was then closed after seeing only 54 patients and basically remaining empty for weeks. Professor Charles Knight's remarks when the London NHS Nightingale was closed are revealing of the true psychology of the Western response to COVID-19. He is reported to have said, and I quote, "It's much easier to build a new hospital than to staff it. And I think the honest answer is that it would have been really very, very, very difficult to staff all those thousands of beds." But we were faced, he goes on to say, with a situation where people were going to die because of a lack of ventilators. So we had to do something because the alternative was unthinkable. But as we discussed in my previous lectures, patients will die if they're put on ventilators without the staff to operate them properly. So what was the unthinkable alternative? Patients dying, or allowing yourselves to admit that your medical services had been reduced to nothing before this novel disease. What also comes through starkly when listening to doctors in the developed world is the lack of experience, at least of recent experience, of dealing with infectious disease. We have already discussed in my earlier lectures how doctors at the center of the COVID outbreak in northern Italy wrote about the misalignment of their current medical practice with the demands of infectious disease. And I quoted to you from a paper in the third week of March by Dr. Nakoti and others that came out while Italy was still in the thick of its outbreak. It's called At the Epicenter of the COVID-19 Pandemic and Humanitarian Crisis in Italy. And it's published in the New England Journal of Medicine, of Medical Science. And this is what Dr. Nakoti and colleagues have to say. Coronavirus is the Ebola of the rich. The more medicalized and centralized the society, the more widespread the virus. In the same vein, Dr. Georgina Piccoli says in her excellent article called Hospitals as Health Factories, published in the Journal of Nephrology, that the coronavirus epidemics should indeed lead to a number of reflections on the organization of healthcare and the way contemporary medicine has lost sight of some diseases, such as infectious ones, that were probably prematurely seen as diseases of the past. And she goes on to say, we have definitely not won the fight against infectious diseases, but we have probably forgotten about them too soon. In a high technology setting, it is all too easy to forget the overwhelming, often dark power of nature. This lack of recent experience in the developed world of dealing with infectious disease is a condition itself brought about by wealth. Most of us are familiar with the idea of demographic transition. A study of the disease profile of countries reveals that in parallel to demographic transition, there is also a kind of epidemiological transition. In low-income countries, the disease burden, that is the deaths from disease in a population, is preponderantly from infectious disease. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, the infectious disease burden is 60%, while the non-infectious disease burden is 20%. In high-income countries like Italy, Germany, the US, France, and the UK, the disease burden is reversed, ranging from about 3 to 8% under the head of infectious disease, and around 90% under the head of non-infectious disease. Developing countries like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh show a state of epidemiological transition to a higher burden from infectious to non-infectious disease in the proportion of about 30% infectious to 50% non-infectious. Some countries like Iceland have no infectious disease burden at all, apart from about 100 respiratory infectious deaths in a year. Yearly infectious disease deaths in Norway and Sweden number in the mere thousands. This is Toy Town compared with larger and more diverse and complex countries elsewhere in the world, whose infectious disease burden is in the tens of thousands, if not the millions. Owing to their small size and relative isolation, Nordic countries were able to keep their COVID incidence relatively low. But you cannot look upon these countries as models for others to follow. And it's important to understand this. These countries are saved from disease by their smallness, lack of diversity, climate, and distance from the rest of the world. These places, which are held up by international development organizations as the gold standard for the world, have no lessons for us, especially not in COVID times. Not only do rich countries have a lower burden of infectious disease, they also have a lower incidence of it owing to climate and geography, Many infectious diseases simply do not exist there, which further limits their experience in dealing with this type of disease. When the full story of COVID-19 is finally told, a chapter will surely be devoted to the lack of experience of Western doctors with malaria, dengue, and fevers of uncertain provenance, which made them hesitate and hesitate again over the use of medications like hydroxychloroquine, broad-spectrum antibiotics like azithromycin and doxycycline, and mild viral inhibitors like ivermectin. These are drugs that are used in malaria, dengue, even deworming and other infectious infections, whose therapeutic effects doctors from Asia and Africa are well familiar with. Even relatively less developed countries like Bangladesh quickly turned to these drugs for treatment and prophylaxis of COVID-19, which may go some way in explaining why this disease spread slower and had a lower mortality in developing countries than in richer ones. While the World Health Organization made the case for disease containment by invoking grim portents of what it called the poor and dense populations of developing countries, it was these countries that led the charge for finding therapies for COVID-19. In Bangladesh, the enterprising Dr. Tariq Alam was the first doctor who designed the ivermectin and doxycycline protocol for patients, which he said gave excellent results. And after that, countries around the world started trying these medicines. He has been asked by several Western countries, including the US, to join clinical trials for ivermectin. I have already described the immediate issuance in India of advisories for the off-label use of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, the work that started for the repurposing of drugs and the development of an indigenous version of favipiravir. Once the US cleared remdesivir, contracts for its manufacture were given to Indian and Pakistani pharmaceutical companies. Nepal and Pakistan were able to rely on their firm ally China for medical supplies and other assistance. India turned to Russia for help with data on favipiravir trials. So the World Health Organization has to stop thinking of Asia and Africa merely as charity cases. We are not entirely without resources against epidemic disease. In fact, our doctors and pharmaceutical companies have shown an agility and resourcefulness in COVID times that matches and even surpasses that of the most advanced countries in the world. There are many ways in which we need to start thinking differently about health issues, especially when we compare countries. An interesting example is the death rate of countries. Even though we think of richer countries as being healthier than poorer ones, the annual death rates of countries are surprisingly similar despite massive disparities in wealth. Going by figures given out by the WHO, and all these figures are linked on my blog, the death rate for most countries of the world is close to 1%, with a few countries at the lower end at about 0.5%, and even fewer countries at the higher end at 1.5%. So the picture that emerges is by no means one of a conquest of death or disease as countries get richer. People in richer countries tend to die from different causes, cancers and heart disease, as compared with those from poorer ones. But there is no escaping death and sickness. They merely come in different forms. People in rich countries have greater average longevity, but the picture of old age that has been revealed from the ravages of COVID-19 in developed countries, which I discussed in my earlier papers, in my earlier lectures, is hardly one to be envied. It looks more like a Faustian deal with disease than a release from it. Personally, I'd rather die of malaria in the arms of my grandchildren at 50 in the African bush then slowly watch myself suffocating to death all alone in a care home in some rich Western country. The World Health Organization and the public health sector in general will look at things like the numbers of physicians or hospital beds per thousand of the population as a determinant of the state of affairs of its health. As a very general point, this is correct. The more doctors and hospitals you have, the more people you can treat. And the richer you are, the more doctors and hospitals you can have. But what should be taken as a tentative opening volley sort of understanding of the health landscape of a country is interpreted too literally and given axiomatic status. Cuba probably has the most medical resources per capita of any country. Its physician per thousand of population ratio is the world's highest at 8 or 9. And the second highest is Sweden's, whose figure is only half of Cuba's at 4. Even the hospital beds to population ratio of rich countries is nowhere near in proportion to the relative wealth of countries. Going by the World Bank system of income classification, the relative wealth of lower income countries to the least wealthy, threshold higher income countries is 1:12. So this will be much higher as you get richer and richer high income countries. Okay, but we start at a ratio of 1:12. And guess what their beds per thousand of population ratio is? It's a 1:3.88, 1:less than 4. And this ratio is even higher when it comes to a comparison of high income countries with lower middle and upper middle income countries. To the 4.82 beds per thousand of high income countries, upper middle income countries have a figure of 3.41 and lower middle income countries 2.8. So about the same and almost half, whereas the disparity in wealth is several times greater. The difference in the percentage of ICU beds between these groups of countries is even lower. High income and upper middle income countries have about the same percentage of ICU beds within their number of hospital beds. And lower income countries have 1.6% compared with higher income countries, which is 3.57%. And lower middle income countries have 2.38%. There are other interesting figures which emerge if you actually start studying them, taking off the glasses that are always put on to us by the public health sector. If you compare the incidence of tuberculosis as a percentage of the number of tuberculosis deaths given by the World Health Organization, you get a figure of about 8.5% for India. So 8.5% for India. And this is the same as the figure for Italy, 8.5%, and Germany, 8.3%. And it's lower, so we are doing better than that for France, which is at about 10.6%, and only double that for the US at 4.6% and the UK at 4.3%. The figure for Kenya and South Africa at 4.3% and 4% respectively is as good or better than that for the US and the UK. The figure for Mexico is about 11%, which is close to that for France. Hang on, it gets more and more interesting. The figure for Sweden is exceptionally high at 17%, almost 17%. Norway has shown zero tuberculosis deaths in recent years, but the number of tuberculosis patients has remained unchanged at about 300 for several years. This might be indicative of some difficulty in Norway's ability to cure tuberculosis even while keeping its victims alive. The year 2002 was a terrible year for TB in Norway, with 100 TB deaths estimated in that year against an estimated incidence of 280 cases. This gives a crude mortality of over 35%. All the data is linked on my blog. In early June, gets more and more and more interesting. In early June, Dharavi, we spoke about Dharavi a couple of lectures back. It's in Mumbai. It is said to be Asia's biggest slum. And it has now recorded, by early July, it had recorded 2,300 cases and 82 deaths from COVID-19. This is nearly 1/3 in Dharavi. 1/3 the COVID deaths and 1/4 of the COVID cases in Norway, even though Norway has about the same to half the population of Dharavi, depending on how many migrant workers fled from Dharavi during the lockdown. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. I must highlight here that, yes, I must highlight this, that these calculations of the, you could call them rough mortality rates, these are not from the WHO. Okay, these are my calculations based on WHO mortality estimates and case incidence estimates for TB. Okay, and you can see again the calculation and the data. I've put it on my blog. The WHO and public health officials, and there's another point, the WHO and public health officials will say that no, you cannot compare country-wise data, and you also cannot compare year-wise data. Okay, but if that is the case, then why are we doing exactly this when it comes to COVID-19? Why are we looking at any data at all? Okay. I argue in another paper which will come out next month that, I mean, we don't really need to look at this kind of data to deal with the COVID crisis. But the data is being put out and it is being used to argue the case for containment. I mean, that's the whole, I mean, if the data doesn't mean anything, then why have epidemiologists at all? Okay, so the whole argument is built around data. And now the WHO is saying that its own data, see, what does data mean? What do these case and mortality figures mean? If you can't compare year-on-year figures for the same country, if you can't compare last year's tuberculosis figures with next year's tuberculosis figures, then what is the meaning of those figures? And the other thing is, what does it mean if you can't compare country to country figures either? Okay, all the WHO and so, I mean, you know, either this means something or it means nothing. All right, and the other thing is that the WHO disease data seems to be nothing other than modeled estimates from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is headquartered in the remote state of Washington in the US. And, you know, for all we know, these people have never been to countries like India, for which they have done all these estimations. The physician per thousand of population ratio, physician density for developing countries is about 0.6 to 1 in South Asian countries and about 0.1 to 0.2 in the poorer African countries like Kenya and 2.6 to 4 in high income countries like the US, UK and European countries. Now, considering this disparity in the physician density, South Asian and African countries are doing quite well to have comparable tuberculosis death rates to the US, UK and Europe. The 4 times higher doctor-to-patient ratio of Sweden to India's did not stop it from having more COVID deaths than India till as late as mid-May. Even accounting for cases that have been missed in South Asia and Africa due to underreporting. This says something about how well doctors are coping with the cases that do come to them, despite the relative lack of resources and the larger number of cases. Even a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, with a physician per thousand of population ratio of 0.1, is managing extraordinarily well. If you look, for instance, at their yearly malaria figures, 1.5 crore reported cases to about 62,000 deaths. And so is Kenya, which has over 27 lakh reported malaria cases in a typical year to 9,800 deaths. So the point here is that there is no straight line between a country's wealth and its hospital resources, or its physician density, or its ability to combat infectious disease, or its ability to manage high volumes of patients. But this is how superficially, mechanically, and crudely the WHO and public policy experts have been thinking about health issues for a long time. We should pause here a moment to explore more deeply the rather curious phenomena of countries like Norway and Sweden appearing to do so badly by their tuberculosis patients despite their great wealth and high physician per thousand ratios, which are 2.9 for Norway and 4 for Sweden. If you look at the WHO's burden of disease data, there is an indication that countries in North America and Europe have had a persistent problem with treating respiratory infections, including influenzas, that flare up into severe respiratory illness, which is what a bad case of COVID is. This is something that the WHO has been recording in its data periodically without seeming to have noticed it or to have understood its import. If you look at the WHO global burden of disease data for these countries in North America and Europe, you see that under the infectious disease head, they have a smattering of TB, meningitis, and diarrheal disease deaths every year. But the bulk of their infectious disease burden comes in the category of what is called respiratory infections. And this is an intriguing category for the WHO to take in the burden of profile listing, because it's not clear why it's taken under a separate head from the rest of all the other infectious diseases which are named per disease: malaria, dengue, meningitis, hepatitis A, and so on. And because technically under their classification key, which is called the WHO International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, this is on their website, respiratory infections include influenzas and pneumonias, but the burden of disease profile does not record deaths under the subheadings of influenza and pneumonia, and simply subdivides respiratory infections into 3 types: upper respiratory, lower respiratory, and otitis, which is ear-related infections. And the bulk of their infectious disease mortality is coming in this category persistently. In Italy, doctors writing about the COVID-19 epidemic noted that there has been in general over the years what they call a heavy seasonality of deaths, with 25% more deaths in the winter as compared with other seasons, and many of these yearly excess deaths, they say, are related to respiratory infections from influenza. Perhaps these respiratory infections have been neglected in rich countries because in terms of absolute numbers, the communicable disease burden totally eclipses, the non-communicable disease burden totally eclipses the communicable disease one. For instance, the US has non-communicable disease deaths of about 22 to 24 lakhs a year, as compared with their TB deaths are in the thousands. They have 1 lakh TB and HIV and AIDS deaths. So the non-communicable burden is massive compared with the communicable burden. And so what seems to have happened is that with COVID-19, not only were richer countries caught by surprise with an infectious disease, which is a category of disease in which they already have relatively low experience, but also with a respiratory infectious disease, which is a category of infectious disease with which they were already not doing very well compared with all the other infectious diseases in their disease profile. By early July, deaths by COVID-19 were double or more than double the annual respiratory infectious disease deaths for the US, Italy, and France, nearly 3 times the annual respiratory infectious disease deaths for Spain, nearly double those for Sweden, and well over those for the UK. So even though COVID-19 deaths might turn out to be a blip in the overall mortality in Western countries, this will be because their mortality profile is dominated by their non-communicable disease burden. But there is no denying that as an infectious disease, the COVID-19 mortality in these countries is unprecedented, massive, and represents a real crisis in their system. At the same time, their disease profile also raises the question of how long COVID-19 can be privileged as it has been when so many more of their people are affected by non-communicable disease. By early July, as I just said, the typical annual number of deaths in the US from non-communicable disease still exceeded COVID-19 deaths by 19 times, and this was exceeded by 24 times in May, and in the UK and Spain by 12 times, and in Italy and France by 16 times. So what these countries need to do is not to narrow the focus to COVID-19, but to expand the focus to include more attention to infectious disease than they have been used to doing in the last 80 odd years. And I think that the public there are right, as a certain section is already doing. They are right to question the excessive focus, the almost exclusive focus on COVID-19, given the disease profile of these countries. And I think that we might actually be in the middle of a much worse and silent health crisis in these places in non-communicable diseases. The situation for developing countries is somewhat different because infectious disease already occupies a large part of the medical attention here. But this might be a good reminder to countries like India not to lose sight of infectious disease as it goes up the income ladder. And another thing to be borne in mind is that with the proliferation of private hospitals, some of our infectious disease burden may also be going unnoticed. It may just be being, effectively suppressed and ignored because it is less lucrative for these hospitals than cancer or heart treatment. In COVID times, it is also important to recognize the value of the general experience of developing countries with large numbers of people and patients. In a given year, developing countries in South Asia and Africa see an infectious disease incidence numbering in the lakhs and crores, that is in the hundreds of thousands and the tens of millions, while developed countries like the UK, Germany, Italy or Spain will see mere tens of thousands of cases. In absolute numbers, even the non-communicable disease burden in the larger developing countries is much greater than that of most developed ones. To give you an example, at India's 2,400 bed All India Institute of Medical Services, AIIMS, this is a huge government hospital in New Delhi, and it's only one of thousands of large government hospitals around the country. The average daily footfall, is 15,000. Okay, so this means that it sees as many patients in 2 or 3 days as some of the biggest US hospitals see in an entire year. And I take the US as an example because it has a large population compared with other developed countries. In 2018-19, AIIMS reported that it saw about 38 lakh patients and 2.5 lakh inpatients and conducted 2 lakh surgeries. Compare this with the US's biggest hospitals. The New York Presbyterian Hospital Weill Cornell Medical Center, which has about 2,200 beds, sees 48,000 emergency room patients and conducts about 77,900 surgeries annually. The Florida Hospital in Orlando sees 32,000 inpatients and 53,000 outpatients annually, and the Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis sees 97,000 patients a year. AIIMS is seeing 15,000 patients a day. This is not to say that developing countries or poorer countries have some kind of magic formula just because they see more cases. But a better understanding of the kinds of numbers developing countries face as a routine would have helped both them and richer countries to respond more sensibly and moderately to the COVID-19 crisis. What's happening is that we are not seeing the relevance of the differences in hospitals and medical practice that grow out of these differences that we have just discussed in the disease profile of countries at different stages in their development. Led by the world's leading authority on disease, the World Health Organization, we think of the differences only in terms of rich and poor and resource constraint or resource abundance. And we fail to see that the nature of medicine, of hospital management, and of disease management practiced in developing countries with a large burden of infectious disease and an endemic lack of resources might actually have lessons for all of us in COVID times. We need to pivot for answers from looking at the richest countries of the world to looking at the poorest ones, because they are the ones with the relevant experience, whereas the richer ones have virtually none. We should have been speaking to doctors who function with less and not more resources, because COVID-19 dwarfs even the world's best resources. Talking to doctors who have cut their teeth in Indian government hospitals is in of itself a fascinating experience, and I'm sure this is the case for doctors in any part of the third world. In the normal round, they see a breathtaking range of diseases among patients of every class and color and in every stage of illness. They function in conditions of perpetual resource shortage. Indian doctors familiar with big government hospitals like AIIMS in New Delhi will describe how patients are lined up on mattresses in the corridors at a pinch. The other day, a dentist friend had me spellbound, describing his early training at King George's Medical College in Lucknow, where there would be 4 patients lined up in a row on dental chairs in the corridor, and he'd treat them simultaneously, injecting one with local anesthetic, leaving the anesthetic to kick in while checking a cavity in the next, and so on. In the pre-COVID era, all this would have had Westerners shaking their heads in horror. But this is life in a crowded and under-resourced situation. And many of the scenes from India that I have described would now be familiar in COVID-hit hospitals in the West. Just a few weeks into their COVID outbreaks, there were reports from Europe of patients being treated in corridors. Public policy experts who are trained in the paradigm of public health thinking and policy thinking in general that comes from the West are particularly close to the idea that they may actually have something to learn from third world countries. What we really needed was public health experts who had the measure of the contrasting disease profiles and capabilities of different countries. We needed experts who could draw upon these diverse experiences with disease and medical resources to suggest new ways of thinking in the COVID crisis. And this is where the WHO, as a supposedly international health authority, could have shown real leadership by bringing the attention of nations to the medical experience with disease beyond their borders in other settings, even in places far away on the other side of the globe, to spark off the novel thinking that this novel disease so clearly requires. But the WHO seems to have no sense of the richness or meaning of the information about the state of disease and medical practice at its disposal from all over the world, even though this information has been collected by the WHO. All the attention is on the decontextualized and disease agnostic and, as it turns out, endemically inaccurate mathematical modeling. They need to sack their epidemiologists or ditch them and really get in to how hospitals and doctors are functioning in different countries, different approaches, and the way in which treatment is carried out, different types of medical practice. one of the things that you have in developing countries is that you don't have, and I didn't have the space to go into this in this already very long papers, but we don't have the uniformity. What I'm seeing in developed countries is that either everything is owned by the government, either it's a big public sector medical service, or it's owned by very big private multinational companies and trusts. And but in our part of the world, in the developing world, you have so many levels at which medical services are organized, from very, very small neighborhood practices by doctors functioning in small towns and almost village type environments, and then somewhat larger practices, neighborhood practices which are a little more fancy, but where the same doctor will be treating people from a room in his own house, sometimes for free, who and have another job, his day job, in a bigger hospital. And then you have clinics where 4 or 5 doctors come together, or 10 of them come together to share the space. But it's still in a neighborhood kind of thing, or it will serve 4 or 5 neighborhoods in the district. And then of course you have the really large hospitals, and in India we are slowly creeping towards the point where these big companies will start buying all of these practices up. But I think that we should actually push back against that, and we should fight for this diversity in our medical practice. It operates in many ways to help on a lot of levels, and I think one very important way in which it functions is that when you have doctors at the less fancy end, these small neighborhood practices, they come often from very close to the same socioeconomic background as the patients who come to them for treatment, and so that puts the patient in a stronger position, because what we always have to remember is that professions like services like law and medical services, these are negotiated. It is always it ought to be there should be a negotiation between the client and the service provider to a certain extent. There's a certain area of discretion, and arguably both lawyers and doctors, it's annoying, but you do learn something from the perspective of your client. And it's also more democratic, especially in health. You're talking about someone's health, their children's health. They should have be in a stronger position. And this is not what happens when you're faced with a big machine, whether it's a big public sector health services, faceless bureaucracy, or whether it's these huge medical oligarchies in the private sector. You don't give that chance. And so these are all things that we should be bearing in mind and thinking about. And let's move the conversation here. All this talk about these models, and it's not taken us very far. We need to be much more. We need to have a much more textured and deep engagement with all these issues than we've been having so far, using just all these numbers and data. Right. The other thing is that we should also pause here. We should also think about numbers differently, because they note the advantage of numbers and of having a relatively larger young working population that countries like India and China have. China tops the world with 28 lakh physicians. By the way, for listeners from abroad, lakhs is 5 zeros and crores is 7 zeros. Okay, so China tops the world with 28 lakh physicians, going by its physician density of 2 per thousand. India's physician density of about 0.9 per thousand gives a total of 11.8 lakh physicians. So even though the US has a higher physician density than both these countries at 2.6, it has fewer physicians in total at 8.5 lakhs. And Italy and Sweden, which have among the highest physician densities of developed countries at 4 per thousand, and UK and Norway have physician densities of 2.8 and 2.9 per thousand, These densities work out to about 1.9 lakh physicians in the UK, 2.4 lakh in Italy, 36,000 in Sweden, and 50,500 in Norway. These are very small pools to draw upon compared with many developing countries. And Cuba, with over 90,000 physicians, is able not only to cater to its own population, but also to send doctors around the world for its famous medical diplomacy. And it's been so disappointing, but also so typical to see how, instead of being grateful for this, Western countries have been berating Cuba for trying to spread influence by offering its doctors to the world. The other thing is that this is not the place to go into this issue in detail, but we really have to revisit the idea that larger populations are nothing but a burden on countries. This is far too simplistic an evaluation of the implications and dynamics of a large population, especially a relatively young one. Having a large population to draw upon in times of emergency has its own advantages. And we also have to look behind the idea of exponential growth. Because there is a type of racism that is inherent in the idea of exponential growth when applied to populations. Almost always, when the scepter of exponential growth has been raised, it has been the bigger and faster growing colored populations of the developing world that the experts have had in mind. The last time that exponential growth was made into an enterprise by the West was in the era when the colored nations, such as my own, had just begun to emerge from colonialism. There was a feeling in the West that these countries would now flood the West with immigrants. And so from the late 1940s to the early 80s, Malthusianism was preached to the colored nations everywhere, and they were encouraged to take drastic measures of population control. It was this that led China to implement its notorious one-child policy and India to unleash its infamous sterilization drive. Much of this was advocated and funded by Europeans and Americans intent on improving the lives of the poor. And many of them were great believers in eugenics and other horrible ideas. What we have to remember is that racial hygiene, population hygiene, disease hygiene, all of these are the dodgy, awful ancestors of the idea of hygiene thinking. That's just a fact. Coming back to the discussion of population growth, once the atrocities of Chinese and Indian population control became known, exponential population growth was debunked as a theory. Because as it was found that as in the case of modeling for COVID-19, nowhere did populations double at the exponential rates that had been predicted. Instead, the phenomena of demographic transition was observed, which, though it gave big populations, also showed the demographic dividend, which is the benefits of a thriving young population. Now, exponential growth has reared its ugly head once again through the discourse of Western epidemiologists. And we should not be naive. We in the third world, in the developing world, colored nations, we should not be naive about the very real fears that the aging and diminishing populations of the developed world, of the West, have about us in the developing world. And, we need to be vigilant about how some of them, try to work through international development agencies like the World Health Organization and UN organizations to keep us in check out of these fears. And I must say that the West also corrects itself and their traditions of of open and fair discussion and of relentless scrutiny and looking backwards. I mean, all of this means that they do correct themselves, and they are forces and people there who always fight back, much more than people over here do. But I mean, we need to be vigilant about this, because there is a tendency from time to time of these Western nations developing, if you're going to talk about exponential, they develop exponential rates of paranoia about us. Whether this is expressed in the form of concern about population growth or pollution or pandemics. Right. So that concludes part 8 of this lecture series. Thank you for your attention. Today's lecture will go up later tonight on my blog, covidlectures.blogspot.com, where the full paper and parts 1 to 7 of my earlier lectures have already been published, along with links to the YouTube videos and podcasts for this series. See you tomorrow, 7 p.m. India time, 2:30 p.m. London time, and 9:30 a.m. New York time on Facebook Live for another round of the COVID lecture series, Dodgy Science, Woeful Ethics. Thank you.